So this is a talk about the effects of oceanic thinking on pedagogies and hope for civic engagement. My own work is about the gendered effects of the narratives and practices of quantification of population, particularly in British colonial South Pacific and post-colonial Vanuatu. I've worked on colonial measures to stop depopulation, which were to lower the bride price in the then New Hebrides in the early 20th century, and I've worked with midwives and healers in Vanuatu and with young mothers who are stigmatized because of the narratives of the now very rapid population growth in this post-colonial context. So I feel accountable to the Pacific Islanders that I've listened to, and I pay attention to the effects of their representation outside Oceania. So as I just said, today I'm not talking about my empirical work, but rather how I've worked conceptually and thematically to make Pacific topics matter outside of this region. Early in my postdoc in Berlin, a well-respected German historian who was perhaps well-meaning as well approached me after a talk that I had given about the effects of demographic narratives in the early 20th century on colonial policies in the Pacific. And she asked me, is it really worth studying these places because they're so small, they're so insignificant, they're so isolated, they're so far away? So after that, I began every talk with some kind of image or story pertinent to the audience to situate this seeming isolation of the Pacific Islands to make them appear as the global issues that they are. And I'm going to tell you 3 of them today. Also, when I began teaching, I opened many of the courses that I taught by adapting a pedagogical tool of a colleague, Ian Kosh, by getting students to draw from memory a map of the world. So having them render the 3-dimensional globe into a 2-dimensional plane. And with very little exception, they drew something like this. So this is the Mercator projection map that remains with us from 1569. So this is obviously a Eurocentric map that distorts regions in their size to Europe's favor, but also when it's juxtaposed with the Pacific-centric map, it's a rendering of the planet that it orients the viewer to emphasize land, and not the reality that oceans cover over 70% of the world's surface. So I started showing a map like this during my talks about the Pacific, not a regional map, but this Pacific-centric map. And so last fall, I showed this map at the beginning of a talk that I gave at a Canadian university. And after this talk, someone came up and said, "Wow, thank you for your fascinating talk. Not to sound ignorant or anything, but what really struck me was how big the Pacific Ocean is. It's so big, but that map is so powerful." So, and over the years, I found that she's really not the only one. Many years later, often, friends and colleagues often bring up this map that I've shown as having had a lasting impact on their thinking. The shape of the Pacific Ocean is hard to imagine because maps enhance the tendency to see oceans as the absence of land. Maps are the physical manifestations of our orientations which deny the shape of the Pacific Ocean, and they're kind of our failure to be able to visualize the Pacific as a whole. So I've now had almost 10 years of working to show how Pacific Island issues are global issues. And more recently, and this symposium has been a nice opportunity, I've been thinking of them not only as global issues, but wondering whether it's an oceanic approach that makes these issues compelling to people who perceive themselves as remote and disconnected from the Pacific. So today I'm going to talk about 3 of these issues that are global issues, but also, I think one could say, oceanic. And oceanic means, as Dan has cited Blum in the workshop description, being attentive to the material systems and praxis of maritime worlds. And I also think it means paying attention to the ecologies and imaginings of the Pacific.